Jack warrior, Janamara, Bonaba warrior, hang away, Binjigo warrior, crazy horse, Lakota warrior, Sitting Bull, Lakota warrior, Shaka, Zulu warrior.
Welcome to this episode of Tribal Fires, coming out of the Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation in Perth, Western Australia. This story is titled On Sacred Ground, from Noonkanbah to the Juukan Gorge. In 1980, I caught a bus from the east side of Australia, from Cairns, across to the most western point of the country, Broome. And it took a number of days, and I arrived in Broome around 11:30 of a Saturday night. And I got off the bus, and the trip was grueling. It had a impact on my body and my mind. And I remember I had a couple of dollars in my pocket. It was again late at night, and the hotel had just closed because I could hear some people in the distance. And I remember seeing just some lights, and obviously knew they were the lights of the pub, and I just followed the voices in the darkness. And I eventually came across a group of black fellas walking back from the pub, and I had my case in my bag, and they helped me with that. Actually, I said who I was, and they said, well, look, you're going to find nowhere to be able to stay in Broome at this time of the night, and you can't just hitch up a tent anywhere. They said, well, look, why don't you just come home tonight to our place, and we'll put you up in the backyard. You can sleep there. And I did, and there were quite a few of the mob there, and I could see a couple of fellas struggling with this massive big plastic container, and they were in the entrenchment on the side of the road. And as I saw them struggling, and I could see that whatever it was heavy. And anyway, we eventually got to the house, and I was taken around the backyard, and they had a fire going. And I'll never forget, they said to me, "You must be pretty hungry." And I said, "Yeah, I'm hungry and thirsty." And they gave me water, and then this box appeared, and out of the box, all of a sudden, on a grill, came all the most prime cuts of the best meats you could imagine. Scotch fillet, T-bone steaks, sausages, chops. So the boys had just done the butcher's shop, and I looked around. I saw a little dog running around with a big steak coming out of its mouth it was eating. So everybody was having a good feed. And then I realised that the butcher's shop paid the price, and the boys put on the feed. And that's something that, is a precious memory of mine, because, they shared in that feed. They welcomed me into their yard. Time was late at night, and otherwise I would have had to sleep in what you would call the gutters of an unknown town. Broome was not a tourist town at that time. Broome was simply a northwest town that tourism hadn't really started to, pick up in Broome. I remember following the next few days, I was told about a camping spot where I could hitch up my then tent, and I could stay. And all it was a caravan park and an area for tents. And it was at a place called Cable Beach, which at that time was led out from Broome by a gravel road. And the only thing at Cable Beach was that camping ground. There was no camel train rides. There was no what became known as the famous nudist beach of Cable Beach. There was no food outlets. It was just simply somewhere to put a caravan and to hitch a tent. So that's what I did. I hitched my tent, and I stayed in that caravan park at Cable Beach for the next number of weeks. And as the time rolled by, and I got quite familiar with not just Broome as a town, but I also got to know a lot of really open-hearted and proper blackfellas in that era. They were really giving people, and they made sure that, you know, as an outsider, I was right, and I was made feel right. And, you know, Broome, as I said, it hadn't boomed in terms of its tourism. It merely had two hotels. The main hotel was the Roebuck Bay Hotel in the main street. There was still the inner town reserve, which they called Kennedy Hill, and that was right next to the hotel. And Kennedy Hill was a famous reserve. That's where all the blackfellas lived, in shanty shacks and, you know, under shelter. There was no housing on the reserve. It was, you know, just a place. There was across the road just a massive big mangrove. Mangroves were growing. There was a jetty. I remember that led out to where the pearl luggers would dock. There was one little small building where the pearlers would reside. And then right down the end of the street was what they called the Japanese quarters, and that's where the Japanese population of Broome would reside. Round the corner was a shop called Matzo's Shop, and then there was a street in which there were a few smaller shops. There was a school and, you know, a hospital, and the basic government resources, government services. There was no shops that, again, promoted tourism, and there was no fast food outlets in Broome at that time. There was no place that sold fast foods. And, you know, that was Broome in its heyday. And it was a special place. And, you know, I remember getting to know certain people, and I got to know a beautiful woman, Aboriginal woman called Rita Bernard. And Rita put me up. She, you know, looked after me. She had got in touch with another man in Broome who knew my family in the southwest, the Hayward mob, and he's passed away now, rest in peace, Philip Dolby, and he had a small, you know, apartment, a small flat, and had asked whether, you know, I wanted to, you know, take up and pay, you know, some of the rent and reside in the apartment, which I did. And, you know, I really look back on that and have fond memories, because, yeah, he offered me a place of solace and a place of safety and protection. So I would have stayed in that little flat for, you know, quite a while. And then I started to realise, you know, by spending a lot of time in the Roebuck Hotel, the type of people that, you know, constituted the Aboriginal population, and the Bardi mob and the, you know, the local mobs in Broome. And, you know, I got to know them well, and I started to realise that with the racial bloodlines that Broome is made up of, that, you know, and they're so proud of. You've got, you know, Japanese, you've got Indonesian, you've got a lot of, you know, Chinese. So you've got a lot of Asian bred bloodlines in with the tribal people, the tribal Aboriginal bloodlines in Broome. And it, you know, created quite a very talented, but also a very beautiful type of looking Aboriginal population. And, you know, I remember, you know, the Pigram brothers, they were really just starting out regarding their music, and they went on to become, you know, worldwide known musicians, really, in terms of Aboriginal music. But in one particular time, I met with the great Jimmy Chai. Jimmy Chai had written Corrugation Road, but he was best known for his musical and play Brand New Day. And, you know, he also, you know, suffered, you know, a number of mental health issues. And, you know, I would sit with Jimmy Chai for hours and hours out on the front veranda of the old Roebuck Bay Hotel, and we would talk about many things, many stories we would yarn about. He was interested in my life. I spent my years in Sydney, and he wanted to know what the eastern states was like, and of course I too wanted to know what his life was like in terms of he was educated in the southwest here and then went back up to Broome. So I met Jimmy Chai when we were young, and I also met another man who now is highly placed in government, Mr. Peter Yu, and he ended up marrying a cousin of mine who I was very close to and had children to my cousin. And in some ways my mother and father raised those children when they were young fellas in Scarborough, in Perth. So the connections were starting to be recognised, and I think that's important in terms of our people and our communities. Is once we start talking and we start joining the dots and the links, we start to understand that we do have connections. And so I started to find them in Broome, and the connections in Broome for me had become one of the most profound experiences in my life. I was sitting one evening, and it was in 1980, on the veranda, again with Jimmy Chai, and we were talking about a protest east of Broome at a place called Noonkanbah. And Peter Yu came up, and he was also talking to us about the building up of the protest and what was happening. And they started then to say that there was a lot of media that was starting to gather in Broome, and this story started to become internationally focused on. And it was important because it was a massive land rights stance. It was a right in which the old people, the elders of Noonkanbah, rallied together to protect the sacredness of their ground. And, being young, I had never been to a protest ever in my life or a rally. And, I was conjuring up all these images in my mind, what it would be like, out there at the community. And all of a sudden, we saw a lot of white people walk into the pub in suits. And, I said to Peter Yu, who are those mob? They, look like detectives. Officers. And he said, no, Rob, he said, that's the media. They're all from Channel 7, Channel 10, 9, the ABC was there. And there was also the BBC. So there was international media in Broome. So, this protest started to gather momentum. And there was a bloke called Dickie Skinner from Noonkanbah who had been down to Perth and had spoken to the government, and in particular to the unions, about what was happening at Noonkanbah and the support that they needed in relationship to stopping the destruction of a very, very sacred ground that was called the Goanna Dreaming Site. And Charles Court was the Premier at the time, the father of Richard Court, and they both followed each other in terms of being premiers of the state. So as we spoke and talked, and Peter Yu said to me, look, Rob, in a couple of days' time, the trucks will be moving in through what they call the T-junction. The T-junction is where the main highway from Perth that leads all the way through and up to Broome becomes a T-junction. So in turning left, you go through into Broome, and by turning right, you go into the East Kimberley. So you go through towns like Derby, Horse Creek, through to Kununurra and towns as such. But, you break off in that journey and you hit gravel and you go in through to Noonkanbah and other remote Aboriginal communities. And they said to me, look, in a couple of days, we're going to go out, Rob, to the T-junction where the trucks will be coming through, and all the local mob in Broome here. And we've called in other people from Derby and, the remote communities in and around Broome to be at the T-junction in protest of the trucks. And I said, well, look, I would really like to and appreciate if I could, come out to the T junction and, and protest and stand alongside of you mob. And the reason I had that thought was because, again, they looked after me when I got to Broome. They made sure that they was right. They had my back. So this was the least I could do, was to join them in the protest of what was happening at Noonkanbah. So, a couple of days rolled by and I went by car with Jimmy Chai and PDU to the T junction. And I witnessed one of the most brutal acts, I would say, against a race of people in terms of how this convoy of trucks, we're talking 16, 17, 20-wheeler trucks that were all carrying huge and massive drilling equipment, all different types of, crane structures. So it was a massive convoy. And I remember there was a lot of people gathered. There would have been well over 400 or 500 Aboriginal people and a lot of little children. So, the children were doing what children do. They were, just running sort of all around the roadway and on the side of the road. And I saw the trucks coming in the distance because I saw all their headlights on, and they were, beaming headlights. And you could see how far the convoy went because the lights actually went out of distance. And the first truck, as it approached, I remember, the crowd of protesters, raising their voice in protest about justice and for the trucks to turn around and go back to where, they had left from, which was obviously Perth. And when I looked into the first truck and into the cabin, I was shocked, because what I saw was not only the truck going just way too fast in the sense of turning right, and all these little kids' lives being put in danger, that, they could have easily been under the truck's wheels at any time. And the first truck approached, I looked into the cabin and I saw the driver. And the driver had a plastic, one of those old clown masks on, and had the fuzzy sort of green hair and the big red lips, and the proper old clown's mask that we used to see at the old show or circuses. And then the second truck came, and same thing. The driver was wearing a clown's mask, and so there, the third, fourth, right through to the very last truck of the convoy, all the drivers had these clown masks on. And I thought to myself, well, one or two things. They obviously were under disguise. They didn't want their face to seen because they knew they were doing a barbaric act against Aboriginal people, but particularly our culture, by taking the drilling equipment into Noonkanbah. And also the fact that, wearing clowns' masks, they were basically making a statement that, as far as they were concerned, they didn't care less. And, laughed about it, because that's what a clown does in a circus. It makes you laugh, it entertains you in the strangest of ways. So all the drivers had these clown masks on. And right through to the last truck, I would say it was just by the grace of the will of the universe that not one child was hurt, nor anyone, injured, because, there was no slowing down. These trucks hurtled through to Noonkanbah. And after the last truck had, driven in and around, we obviously, talked a bit out at the T junction, and, the disappointment. And, there was media everywhere. All their cameras were set up. So, Channel 9 and Channel 7 and 10 and the BBC, they all took footage of the convoy. And the convoy was actually set up and coordinated at Midland Brick in Midland, down here in Perth. It left from Midland Brick. So the last three trucks of the convoy carried a massive amount of bricks, house bricks, And at the time, for Charles Court to get some form of tick, if you like, by a senior Aboriginal person that would support the convoy and support the drilling of the sacred site, the then chairperson of the Aboriginal Lands Trust, who was also the chairperson of the Museum's Cultural Materials Committee, stated publicly in the paper and on the news that where the proposed drilling of AMAX, which was the company, was to take place, was not a sacred site. And that devastated us as Aboriginal people, because of course it was a senior man to whom had a lot of respect in our community at that time and right through to his death. But not many people knew that he had given the tick or the green light for that drilling to go ahead. So the trucks that had the bricks that I spoke about on them stopped at a community just north of the city, and they offloaded all of the bricks at a particular community. And what happened was that those bricks then were bricks that were used to build the first houses and the first ablutions on the community in which this man also coordinated. So that was the payoff, the bricks. And I remember in Broome, a day or two later, Jimmy Chai saying to me, Rob, this protest is massive out in the community. He said, and it was, in the era of the time that the government appointed what we called Aboriginal police aides or cadets. And what had happened was they gave a whole lot of cadetships to become police aides to a huge number of Aboriginal men at Noonkanbah. So they gave them police uniforms, gave them authority badges and batons, obviously no firearms. And those police aides lined one side of the community and the entry of the community, and the protesters were all on the other side. And the sad thing was that, it was for the first time that such a powerful strategy that was ironic was set against our people, to turn brother, against sister, against uncle and auntie, because the police aides were arresting and dragging off their own relations under the authority of what the government had granted them to do. And, that was a devastation in terms of a strategy by government. And the reason I know that is because I saw that happen. I was again sitting on the veranda of the Roebuck Hotel, and Jimmy Chai said, look, Rob, Channel 9 have asked for myself and PDU to fly out to Noonkanbah. And they said there's one seat on the Channel 9 news plane, aircraft. Would you like to join us? And I said, well, I've come this far. I thought to myself, I said to Jimmy Chai, yes, I'd love to come out to Noonkanbah and join you in the protest out on the community. So I ventured and I got my things ready for whatever I needed to. And I then boarded the Channel 9 light aircraft, the media aircraft. And no sooner I was in the air on my way to the Noonkanbah protest. And this protest was the first time I ever raised my clenched fist in the air. And there were many one-finger salutes happening at the trucks and the issue dealing with what happened that was happening at Noonkanbah. So by that aircraft and that chance and possibility, I think led me on to my life's work in terms of Dumbartung and our street rallies and protests. So, yep, we boarded the Channel 9 aircraft and we went out to Noonkanbah.
Aboriginal people have always fought hard to live on and control their land. One such struggle was at Noonkanbah in Western Australia in 1980. It took the multinational mining company AMAX, supported by the Court Liberal state government, 2 years before they could drill for oil on sacred land. While drilling eventually proceeded, the fight of the local Aboriginal people inspired broad community support and raised Australia's treatment of Aboriginal people on the international stage. But in March 1978, a letter arrived from AMAX informing the community of their intentions to drill for oil on their land. WA was in the middle of a resources boom, and by May 1978, there had been 497 mineral claims pegged out on Noonkanbah. The community met and decided they would resist all attempts to drill. They had already had bad experiences with mining company CRA tramping across their property, disturbing burial sites and removing sacred ceremonial objects. One of their leaders, Dickie Skinner, went to Perth with a petition. These people have already made the place no good with their bulldozers. Our sacred places they have made no good. They messed up our land. They exposed our sacred objects. Today we beg that you truly stop them. Skinner's visit to Perth received much media attention, and while there he addressed the WA Trades and Labour Council, which passed a resolution in support. Court, however, had built his career by championing the resources industry and was an ardent opponent of land rights. The Aboriginal citizens of this state do not need land rights, he declared. They need the support of assistance they are getting now. Court refused to acknowledge an anthropological report that found the whole area had spiritual significance for the Yanangora. He also dismissed a letter written by the Yanangora demanding the government recognise us as the real owners of the land, claiming it was the view of interfering outsiders.
So Noonkanbah created a massive conflict between the West Australian government, the community at Noonkanbah, and obviously all Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people who were supporting the stance against what AMAX and the drilling company had did at Noonkanbah. They went ahead with the drill, and, I remember at Noonkanbah had started to, in a lot of ways, create its own spiritual and physical momentum in relationship to the protest. And by this time, there were hundreds of Aboriginal people who had gathered from varying and different, remote Aboriginal communities and from townships that had made their way to Noonkanbah. So, the conflict was potentially, I would say, one of the first close, experiences that could have resulted in very, very violent outcomes between, our rights as Aboriginal people to protect our sacred ground and that of a government's decision to mine and to destroy that sacred ground. And these conflicts were so evident at Noonkanbah. When they actually, drilled, it was following a commentary which shocked me, because it was stated to the people of Noonkanbah at the height of the protest by Stephen Hawke, which was the son of Bob Hawke. And he addressed the protesters and the groups. And I remember him saying to people basically that, you know, his father, who was Bob Hawke, head of the ACTU unions in Australia, had sent a message to the people. And the message that Stephen Hawke said that his father was relaying to the Noonkanbah community and all the protesters was that the unions would assure that the drilling does not go ahead. He said, my father has spoken, and that the workers will refuse to operate the drills that were set up to drill in to the Goanna Dreaming site. And what that did, it actually calmed the people. It settled the people. It gave them a type of rejoice. They trusted the word of this man, the son of Bob Hawke. They trusted his word. And it then put the protest onto a complete different, level. It pacified the protest. And the sad thing about that was that 2 weeks later, after Stephen Hawke had, stated that comment, the AMAX drill smashed through the sacred site of the Goanna Dreaming in Noonkanbah, smashed the mounds in which the site was part of, and the people's spiritualism, they're linked to that sacred cultural site, and all that was part of their culture, their spiritualism was smashed in one hit by AMAX. And it was an exploratory drill. It meant that they were drilling just to see whether oil existed under that site. And to this day, oil had never been taken from the site. So, it broke the back of the people of Noonkanbah really forever. The protest at Noonkanbah, I've always said, and I've always known, as being probably the most important remote Aboriginal community protest in the history of Australia. To me and my way of thinking, it was far more important than the Wave Hill walkout in terms of the protests of, the stockmen's rights. There were other massive protests that were happening, a few years later, such as the Swan Brewery protests here in Perth and the Hindmarsh River, the bridge in Adelaide, the women's sacred site areas. You had a lot of protests in terms of looking after the sacredness of land that followed Noonkanbah. But Noonkanbah really, to me, remains the predecessor. It is the most important protest that I believe has taken place in this country. There was a incredible film that shows how the government representatives, negotiated and spoke to the elders at Noonkanbah prior to the drills going down and smashing that sacred site. Now they were talking to them like they were little primary school children. It's called On Sacred Ground, and it is, it tells the story of Noonkanbah. And I think, our young people in particular, and people who aren't really aware of what happened at Noonkanbah all those years ago, should try to access this documentary and watch what happened when a Premier of Western Australia, as the story states, was supportive of the resource boom and how far he was prepared to go in terms of confrontation with Aboriginal people. He would have, absolutely created a situation of where, we would have seen our first really civil unrest in this country in terms, if not Stephen Hawke, by pacifying by lies and deceit. And of course, one can only say that at the end, the drills were operated by the workers, and they weren't bought-in workers. They were workers that were union members. So, of course, the unions did get greedy, and the unions went ahead and supported the smashing of the Noonkanbah site. So, I remember then, of course, leaving Noonkanbah and going back to Broome. There was a sense of defeat. There was a sense of great sorrow, a loss of culture, a loss of heritage, trying to protect something that, is extremely ancient, not only had, cultural significance to the Aboriginal people of Noonkanbah, but had, anthropological and archaeological importance to the whole of humanity, because we're talking about sites that are older in terms of their significance than any sites anywhere on the planet. The site was considered to be 40,000 years old, where people were gathering to carry out ceremony. So it was a massive loss to all people and to the world. So as time went by, and I started to feel that my time in Broome was coming to an end, and my connections in Broome also extended into, as I said, to a lot of the families that sheltered me, took me in from the storm, if you like, and looked after me whilst I was up there. I travelled back down through to Perth, and after a number of jobs in the Aboriginal community, I commenced working in 1989 at the Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation. And as time went on in terms of my work at Dumbartung, and we were fortunate because we had open agendas, so we could administrate our initiatives culturally, and we could actually implement them into our community for all the betterment in terms of striving to heal and to make stronger and our people's sense of belonging, our connections to our identity. Because in the southwest, of course, what happened at Noonkanbah had happened 150 years before on a much greater scale. All of our people's sites and our culture, our spirituality had been dispossessed and smashed by the system and by the Western world. So Noongar people were in a complete different space culturally than people that were in that era in the northwest and in the desert areas. So my work at Dumbartung also started to become active, because I always in my mind thought about Noonkanbah, and I also knew that Noongar people here, Bibbulmun people, we had to stand up for our human rights. And the only way that we could stand up for our human rights was through activism. So Dumbartung actually took on, through my coordination and the project officers here, a very strong role in rallies and protests. We ran 3 major rallies. The first one was in 1991, which we called the Yokai Rally, and that was a massive rally regarding our human rights, but particularly Aboriginal people's right to housing. It was against cultural exploitation and, of course, media racism. In particular, some of the shock jocks at the time, it was alive, a man called Howard Sattler, would pollute the airwaves in Perth regarding his racism and what he thought about Aboriginal people. And he actually, he was a huge motivator of racism in this city. And Dumbartung, rallied against his, against his racism and the racism in media. So that was the Yokai rally, and again, it was a massive rally. We also ran the Yena Woombadan rally, and again, that was basically for the human rights of our people. And then we ran a rally called Jita Budja rally, and that was about land and our rights to land, not to do with native title and the issues that come with native title. This was about, still in those eras, about land rights, which is very different to native title. Then I remember, as my time in Dumbartung progressed, and I'd been here for now 33 or 4 years, 2 years ago I got a phone call, and the phone call was from a Aboriginal man, and we spoke, and he said, Rob, a couple of days ago, and this was in 2021, so it was during the first lockdowns of the COVID viruses that hit Australia and in Perth here. He said to me, the public aren't aware as yet, he said, but Rio Tinto, the mining giant, had blown up 2 rock shelters as part of a removal of an iron ore deposit in the Pilbara. And he said the rock shelters were under the Heritage Act. They were protected, or supposedly to be protected under the Act. And what Rio Tinto did was blast both the shelters. And one shelter had evidence, they had found implements and removed them, which were over 28,000 years old, which were kangaroo bones that were used to scrape back and to remove meat from skin and carve implements. And in the other rock shelter, they had found a fossilised imprints of a fire pit and 6 fossilised shapes of Aboriginal people sitting around the fire pit. So they found remnants in the ashes of the cave shelter, wood, and of course kangaroo meat. So what they archaeologically put together through scientific evidence was that 46,000 years ago, I would say 46,000 years ago, a family of Aboriginal people sat around that campfire in that shelter and ate a kangaroo meal together. And in one hit of a detonation button, Rio Tinto blew that away forever. So he said to me, look, Rob, you've run all these rallies, you've been active in terms of the human rights of Aboriginal people. We're not sure what the elders are going to do up there in the Juukan Gorge. That's where the shelters were. He said, but look, somebody needs to raise the consciousness publicly of what's happened at Juukan Gorge. He said, and the only person that we see or organisation that we see that's capable of that is Dumbartung. What do you think? I said, well, I'll look more into it and I'll come back to you. And I did. And at first it was a pretty eerie thought, in terms of how to deal with this issue. The caves were blown apart. Rio Tinto is it's a huge mining giant worldwide. So I thought at first, well, what we're going to have to do is make it public. So a rally of one nature or another needs to be coordinated and called for. So what we did was, myself and my wife Selena here at Dumbartung started to coordinate the first public rally against Rio Tinto and what they did at Juukan Gorge. So we set a date and we worked towards a rally active outside of Rio Tinto's offices in Perth in a place called Central Park that's actually owned by Rio Tinto. And it's a quaint little manicured grassed area where for their staff they can take their lunch breaks, they can get out of the office and they can relax somewhat. So we set up our logistics and our proposals. That's where we were going to have the rally, which we called Budja Neutsch rally, which meant land dying. So we coordinated the rally. We put extreme thought into the process, and we had to find a way in which we could assert certain outcomes from the rally for our people, but we also needed to ensure that we had a connection directly with the elders of the area in which the rock shelters were in, and that was a very difficult part of this process. So what Dumbartung did was we drew a bigger picture, and we looked at it being a international rally, looking at environmental damage and issues around the globe in which Rio Tinto has been responsible for. And it didn't take long to see that there had been major union protests in the Amazon and America and in Africa against this mining giant. So Dumbartung set out a series of assertions, which meant this is what we wanted, or we at least needed to draw out from Rio Tinto as a response for what they did. And we negotiated directly with the Rio Tinto executives, and they agreed that they would meet with representatives of Dumbartung following the rally, and they did. The only way which we could get really to the company itself was actually through its shareholders. So, we started to write letters, and Selena would be, posting them, day after day after day. One evening I was sitting in Dumbartung and I got a phone call from a woman in Singapore, and she said, "Is that a Mr. Eggington?" I said, "Yes." She said, who she was and where she was from, which was most important, because I spoke to Selena and I said, "Look, Selena, I think the only way really to get responses from Rio Tinto and this monolith is through what feeds their engines, which of course are their shareholders." So this woman said, "I'm from BlackRock, and we're one of the major investors into Rio Tinto." She said, "I have in front of me a letterhead that's got this big massive flame coming out of the page of the letterhead." And she said, "This snake that's formed," she said, "it's drawn my attention directly to the message that's on the letterhead." And she said that, they were aware of what Rio Tinto had done. They certainly did not agree with, nor did they accept the fact that the company that they have got massive shareholding agreements and financial transactions with did the right thing. They did the wrong thing. And she said that, the assertions in which Dumbartung had outlined, that BlackRock agreed to those. And to understand this one particular company, you got to put it into a perspective. They generate 3.8 trillion American dollars as a profit per year. So everything you would touch in your normal day-to-day life has got some formal connection with this company, BlackRock. Everything from which you cook your food with, you walk with, everything in your house, in your office, has somehow connected to this one company called BlackRock. Another was China Aluminium, which is another $1 trillion company. There were responses from China Aluminium, and of course Aberdeen Superannuation. So Dumbartung started to put the pressure on the shareholders. And the assertions in which Dumbartung put down, and we did this as close as we could do with the traditional owners, they had and were dealing with it their own way anyway, was that Dumbartung called for the immediate termination of the international chairperson of Rio Tinto, Jacques, and also the national chairperson who was situated in Perth here, Mr. Chris Salisbury, and also a public affairs officer. We called for a buffer zone to be put around the destroyed site so that, there couldn't be any other further destruction, if you could create any further destruction to it, to keep Rio Tinto and other companies away from it, and how the elders would deal with that. But one of the assertions we called for, some might call tripe politics, but I think it was important. It was for Rio Tinto to, on the eve of the recognised United Nations Day for Indigenous peoples worldwide, which was the 12th of August, was for Rio Tinto to, at 6:30 in the evening, to turn off their massive big red neon sign above their building in Perth. The Rio Tinto building is one of Perth's tallest skyscrapers, extremely visible from a sacred site of our old Whadjuk people called Katagara, commonly known as Kings Park. So we gathered up in Kings Park on the eve of the recognised Indigenous Peoples Day, and we had set up the connection for our community and contacts, and a number of people gathered. Unfortunately, not as many as one would have liked to have seen, but there were Aboriginal people there. And as time went on and it got darker, and we were up there at Kings Park, Katagara, came 6:30 on the dot, all of the three sides of the big massive building of Rio Tinto, all the lights went out and the building stood in darkness. And what that represented to us, and turning off these huge neon signs on top of these buildings isn't as easy as just turning on a light switch inside your house to turn on the lights in a room, etc. They had the Metropolitan Perth Fire Brigade, there were pyrotechnicians, there were emergency services, because to turn these huge lights on and off, it had massive implications. The logistics were pretty incredible. But what it did, by putting itself into darkness, we made a statement that in that darkness laid the shame of what Rio Tinto had done, not only to, the Aboriginal cultural heritage of Juukan Gorge, but the shame of what they have done to Aboriginal people and Indigenous people worldwide. And, it was a statement. And the statement is what was important. It's become a very historical point in the time of our people. I believe will be in the, time to come in the future, will be something that, our communities and our future generations will look back on as a very, very important form of activism that Dumbartung asserted against such a massive mining company such as Rio Tinto. Following Dumbartung's activism, of course, due to the lockdowns of COVID when they were lifted, the bandwagons, of course, were created, and many Aboriginal academics, elite black academics and other academics, they all jumped on the issue, and there was a parliamentary national inquiry called, which Senator Pat Dodson led. And of course, they looked at what happened. Dumbartung also called for the direct termination of the then State Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and Treasurer Ben Wyatt, and the Federal Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Ken Wyatt, both Aboriginal men. And the reason we called for their terminations was because they knew that those blasts were going to take place before the blasts happened. And the Federal Minister, Ken Wyatt, passed the issue of Juukan Gorge and what happened up there from the portfolio of Aboriginal Affairs to the portfolio of the environment under Susan Lay, who is a non-Aboriginal woman. And of course, Ben Wyatt crawled out from it by other means. But both those men should have been terminated, and, held in disgrace by our communities for what they had done. And it's sad, but it must be said now that Ben White has left his position in government here. He's now a board member of Rio Tinto and Woodside. So, he's making money out of the government through his representation, and of course money straight from the mining giants that created this problem regarding the devastation at Juukan Gorge. So, Dumbartung still sits all this time later, years later, and never has Dumbartung received a phone call or a connection from anywhere in Australia regarding our activism and how we brought this to the attention of the world. Internationally, we did interviews on RTR Going Underground, which is a Russian-funded current affairs program that comes out of London. We did all of the initial Australian news, electronic news articles and presentations, and of course all of the newspaper presentations. So the sad fact is, as I'm saying, is that when the dust settled and those that took the grace of talking about Juukan Gorge and what happened, they didn't really realise the manifestos in which Dumbartung created to get to the highest levels of Rio Tinto, which was through their shareholders. I want to make a point of that because I think that when you look at making changes for our people in terms of our human rights, but to protect our heritage and our culture, I think that native title doesn't cut it for the protection of our land. It's more based on the commerce, or the iluas they call it, what you can get through royalties. So you're giving your value to your land in terms of the same sorts of values as the Western world does. You start to look at how much land is worth in terms of monetary or financial gain. And I think as Aboriginal people, when we start to look at our land, we call our mother, our culture is linked to our identity through our budja, the same name that we use here in the southwest for the land, which is budja, is the same word near we use for when a woman is carrying fetus when she's pregnant. We call her, she's budjari. So that connection to the land spiritually is really, really important. And native title, it sort of cuts across that and creates our land into a capitalistic commodity, which you can, and how to make money from. Land rights is a very different concept. And when you do follow the value of how much your land is worth in terms of money, you then become a stranger unto its spirit and its spirituality. And, our earth, our land, our mother, she's worth fighting for. She's worth preserving, and she's certainly worth dying for. So our fight as Indigenous peoples right around the world must continue and become more active and stronger in looking after and protecting what's left of the sacredness of our earth and our connection to the earth. So, over the years, Dumbartung has shared in the relationships with a lot of very, very senior Aboriginal law people that have represented major organisations culturally across this country, from the Nananjara and the Pintinjara women in the central desert areas of Australia, KALAC, which is the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Cultural Centre. We've had massive connections for a long, long time with those organisations that represent looking after their cultural needs and stances with land and the issues of land. But, Dumbartung had a major connection with a group of traditional lawmen from One Arm Point, originally Sunday Island. And, I met with the most senior of those lawmen when I was very young. And I travelled around the world with those senior lawmen, and they taught me many, many things that were just simply spiritually magical, that were intense in terms of, their understanding of their relationship with the earth. They would read sacred boards that Dumbartung is in care of and are in our vaults here at, as part of our collections. And, they would read the creation of, life forms and different ways that the earth had been contoured through. Very much could read those boards. And, they say Aboriginal language was an unwritten language, and of course it was. But when you see these old lawmen reading these sacred boards like a priest would read a Bible about how this earth, universe, and all within it was created, then you start to understand just how important culture is. And, when you lose your culture and you lose your connection to the Buddha, and you lose your sense of identity, your belonging, then it's hard to retain that back once it's lost. So I want to, I suppose, end this this story by giving tributes to the following lawmen and women in which Dumbartung has been so closely linked to, that had nursed my and Selena's babies when they were young, our kids when they were young, when they were babies. They had stayed in our home, and they've guided and looked after my spiritual interests in Dumbartung and made me strong to keep true to what we believe in at Dumbartung. Our maxim, may our campfires burn forever, comes from this relationship. And Selena so rightfully knows that's when I've gone overseas on campaigns like the Marlow Morgan campaign, fighting for the intellectual property rights of our people. These old people who are all now passed away float through our lives to this very day, protecting us, giving us the strengths, giving us the aspirations, but more importantly, the visions to keep our cultural connections strong. We can't get that from government. We can't get that from outside interests. We can only get that from our old people. And it's regardless of whether those old people are still alive in this world or whether they've passed on to the next. They are the protectors of our culture and our link to that. But more importantly, the work that myself and Selena endure and do in terms of Dumbartung. They protect us. So my first tribute is to a man to whom I first met many, many years ago. I saw him being given a national award, and I travelled to see him. I lived with him for a while up in Millstream, up near Roban. So I want to give the tribute to Mr. Woodley King of the Nurawana movement. And Woodley King was a major lawman of the Pilbara people. Paul Sampy, elder and a medicine man of great significance from One Arm Point. Peggy Patrick, a Warman woman from Turkey Creek. Peggy was the most senior of law women. No, woman's law or ceremony would happen unless Peggy was there at the ceremonies. Peggy was one of the ones that nursed our children when they were babies and had a strong connection to our youngest daughter, Corinda. Billy R. Chu, who dreamed the Ilma of Little Wigan, and that Ilma, that corroboree, was performed to Noongar people for the first time by the Bardi mob way back in 1983 when, I brought them down to Perth and they went into the prisons and performed for our mobs down here, performed at the two Kayana festivals in Perth. So, their tribute is strong from Dumbartung. Nugget and Harry Johnson from the Luma community. Luma is one of the most important communities in this country. It's where the sea and the land laws cross, and Luma is important in terms of its community and its position to our culture, as is Parliament House to Western politics. So Nugget and Harry Johnson again stayed at our home. Lockie Coomerang was the last of the great Bardi medicine men, and I must say that myself and Paul Sampy were the only two men given a right to speak at the burial of Lockie Coomerang. So that connection again was so strong with the Bardi mob, and Lockie Coomerang as an elder I would never forget. But my very special tribute today, my very special tribute and recognition, and my heart bleeds for this man. He taught me everything I knew, my honour, my knowledge, my connection to the spirit world and our culture. Mr. Aubrey Tygan, he was a massive connection for me and my family, and we loved him until the day he passed. I was up in Strelly in the community, and I saw the Kintor mob come to Strelly, 4 truckloads of men with massive big sticks ready for a full-on brutal enforced conflict with the mobs at Strelly. And I saw 2 men. One, his name was simply Snowy, and the other was Don McLeod, a white man who wrote a book called How the West Was Lost. Don McLeod went through the law. He was an extremely well-respected man right through the Central Desert and the song lines that ran right through the northwest and through to the central parts of Uluru, and then right through to Kuri country. So, Don McLeod was a very strong man, and I saw him with just 3 movements of his hand disengage the potential conflict with the Kintor mob, and all the trucks turned around and just drove off. Not a word spoken, just a movement of their hand. Joe Brown, who is still with us, is a senior member of the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Cultural Centre. Joe Brown came down with a group of senior Aboriginal lawmen when Dumbartung repatriated over 40 sacred objects from overseas institutions and local, museums, and they all gathered, and Joe was only young at the time, and myself and all these senior lawmen that did come down, and they took the majority of those objects back to, the northeast Kimberley area and Jigalong and out that way. They sang their songs all the way back to where they had come in from. So Joe Brown is now a very senior lawman up in Kalak, and he still lives. So with that, I give my respect tributes to Joe. And there was a man to whom was a pretty incredible man and had a lot of involvement, a very well-known Aboriginal man, Black Alan Barker, simply called, and he was from the Bloodwood Tree Association in Port Hedland. So, I just wanted to give the tributes to those elders to whom have not only been part of Dumbartung, they actually constitute the beating heart of our spiritualism here. Dumbartung has fought for the rights of our culture to be, what our culture is supposed to be in the proper way with our customary cultural law. We hold our culture and our links with the cultural bosses, those that are still transmitting out in the deserts as we talk now, the Tamanai and the Belgo communities. They're transmitting that cultural, that secret knowledge from one generation to another. Their connections with Dumbartung still remains extremely connected and strong. And that's the very nature and connections that keep and will keep our campfires burning forever.
In memory of the great Bardi elders, the people of the pearl shell and totems of the great shark and sea eagle, protecting the Marlow Morgan campaign's spearhead with the strength of the ancient Ilma, keeping safe the campaign from the many attempts that sought to destroy the heart of what has become the most intense spiritual warfare to protect the sacredness of the oldest living culture on the planet. Robert Eggington, 2020. May our campfires burn forever.